ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Hamazkayin, Executive Committee of Western United States, I welcome you all, and I'd like to welcome you to this interesting lecture by Professor James Russell of Harvard University's St. Mesrop Mashdod Chair. The lecture will be on the last of Paulicians in medieval Armenia. I'd like to welcome Professor Richard Bekmedjian, Senior Professor of Political Science at USC, to say a few words and introduce to you our distinguished speaker. Thank you.
Professor James Russell. I promised that I would only speak about him for 3.5 minutes, unlike what the Armenian tradition requires. But as I look at his CV, I'm struck by a sense of inferiority. His achievements are so impressive that even someone like me who's been around a little longer than him, just a little longer, I've asked myself, what have I been doing all this time? He's an incredible record. Things Armenian attracted him at the age of 15. James Russell received a bachelor's degree at Columbia College. I believe that was in 1974, about 10 years after I left Columbia. And then he went down to Oxford University, and he received a PhD from the School of Oriental and African Studies of the University of London. Between 1979 and 1980, he was Director of Cultural Affairs at the Diocese of the Armenian Church in New York City. And it was at that point, I believe, that I first met him, or however, today he didn't remember me. From 1980 to 1992, he was a professor, an assistant and associate professor at Columbia University. And from 1992 to 93, he taught at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Since 1993, James Russell has been Mashdod's Professor of Armenian Studies at Harvard University. His books include Zoroastrianism in Armenia, published in 1987, Hovannes Todkuranzi, and The Medieval Armenian Tradition, published in 1987, Introduction to the Text of the Book of Lamentations by Grigor Naregatsi, numerous articles. His interests: he has fascinating theories about the background, the personality, and the identity of Mesrop Mashdods. He's interested in Armenian mythology, the female demon Hushkaparik, and he's interested in the Armenian epic. He's writing a book on that subject. Today he's talking about the Paulicians, a mysterious topic by itself. I remember when I first read at Columbia an old copy published over 100 years ago by the great British Armeniologist Conybeare. And I was struck. I couldn't drop it. Because as one who has grown up in the Armenian Church and one who knew a little bit about Krapar as a deacon in that institution, I began to be struck by the types of prayers where keywords were different. Jesus, the mediator and the intercessor. I am afraid that much of the Armenian history we've learned is the received version of Armenian history. The Tondrakis, or the Paulicians, are probably the soft underbelly of the Armenian historical development. Was Saint Gregory a Tondraki, a Paulician? Were the Paulicians those who took Paulicianism to the Cathars, the Bogumils, the Bosnians today, the Albigeois, and their fascinating occult practices, and the incredible similarities that I found out between Islam and the Paulicians? All of these, we hope that our speaker today will illuminate. James Russell, I'm delighted.
Thank you for your very kind, very moving introduction, particularly to the subject of tonight's, can you hear me? Subject of tonight's lecture. Is it working? Yes, I think so. I have to thank everybody for braving this weather, which I brought with me from Boston. And I note also we're on Harvard Street, so I feel completely at home in the gray, the damp, and the rest of it. Sireli Barakamnesh. Այսիրիկ Վանյա լույտս հղացավ անակնկալ հանդիպումի մբաճառավ։ 3 ամիս առաջ բարեկամներս մեկը այտնեց, որ 95 տարեկան յուրտրացին Պալխիկյան աղանդավոր է, իսկ ես զարմանալով և ագանչիս լսածին չավադալով այցելություն գարկադրեցի։ Մեր հարցազրույցի երախարիկն է հետևյալ հետազոտությունը, որու ընթացքին ճանաչել եմ Պալխիկյան շարժումի պատմական հիմքերն ու գաղափարախոսական առանձնահատկությունները բացատրել հայոց աշխարհի խայտապղետ կրոնական ֆոնին վրա։ Այդուհանդերձ ցկտեր եմ Դիար Խաչատուր Ասլանյանի արտիականությամբ ներշնչված Պալխիկյան վարդապետությունը, զետեղել պատմական Պալխիկյան և ընդհանուր աղանդավորական ոլորտի մեջ։ Առիթը եզակի էր, քանի որ Սան Դիեգոյի բնակ հայ թոնդրակեցին վերջինն է իր համայնքի ու հայոց հոգևոր կյանքի փառավոր մի հատվածի և չթողնենք, որ այդ ժառանգությունը մոռացվի բոլորովին։ Շարունակեմ անգլերենով։ The Paulician heresy is first mentioned in Armenian ecclesiastical documents of the 6th century. It spread to Byzantium shortly thereafter, and thence to the Balkans, where it inspired a priest named Bogomil to formulate his own religious teaching, which in turn exerted its influence on the evolution of the Cathar and Albigensian heresies of Western Europe. In Armenia, despite almost continuous persecution, communities of Paulicians endured down to the mid-19th century, although after the 10th century they were known under another name as Tondraketsis, after a place called Tondrak. After that, there is no more notice of them. In April 1995, I was introduced by an Armenian-American friend from San Diego to a 95-year-old man, an Armenian born in Divrichi, Greek Tefrike, this town in the district of Sivas, Sebastia, in central Anatolia, had been the center of the Paulician sect at its zenith of power in the 9th century AD. but was devastated by the Byzantine Emperor Basil I in 972. This man, Mr. Bob Lyon, originally Khachatur Aslanyan, claimed to be a Paulician, having learnt the teachings of the sect in his childhood at the knees of his grandmother. In a series of interviews conducted by my friend Jack Bournazian and myself, Mr. Lyon described his beliefs and expressed many thoughts and emotions about Paulicianism, about so-called Orthodox Christianity, and about the world in general. The field of the study of heresy is enormous, and the brief remarks that precede my presentation of Mr. Lyon's testimony, an analysis of it, are meant only to provide some context, not only for their content, but for their sentiment, which seems to me to accord strikingly with what we can gather from the written sources about the passions that motivate Christian dissident thought in general. The early Christian church was not, as many believe, a wholly unified organism, nor were its beliefs simple ones from which the more complex dogmas of present-day churches evolved. It was in fact a great congeries of different trends of thought and styles of organization. So-called Orthodox Christianity, in the broadest sense, came over centuries to be characterized by a hierarchical male priesthood, a large body of theological dogma, a corpus of iconography, and a set of ritual observances, which differed from place to place. Orthodox Christianity asserts that Jesus Christ was both God and a person, but recognizes that it is very hard to understand correctly what this coincidence of infinite and finite qualities, or natures, is, or what further it implies, though his mystical presence is real and can be felt. Because he is not here physically to speak to us, we are obliged to study and to understand, as well as possible, the recollections of him. The word Avet Aran in Armenian means a collection of recollections, aponimonephmata in Greek, from two words, Aran meaning a collection, suffix, and Avet being the old Iranian word abiyata, modern Persian yad, memory, a collection of the memories of the deeds of our Lord. We must study these recollections left by his disciples, in which he instructs us to perform certain rituals and tells us something about heaven and hell, God and Satan. As an example of a ritual of particular significance to this discussion, Christ was baptized, as you know, at the age of 30. But he established baptism as a protection, the Orthodox churches believe, against Satan and the effects of original sin. Baptism is a rite infused with power, and the sooner a child receives it, the better. Hence, infant baptism. Since many aspects of Christ's life on earth were foretold in prophecy, and were not simply the deeds of a human being, but the fulfilling of a tremendous cosmic plan, certain places like Bethlehem or Jerusalem, or things like the Holy Cross, are sacred. And through St. Peter, Jesus passed down the keys and mysteries of priesthood, and the priests became the intermediaries of God and man. Other Christian groups, however, disagreed profoundly with all or almost all of the above contentions. They were numerous, but found themselves frequently excluded from power, perhaps by virtue of their very views, which seem profoundly alienated from any power structure. They assert Jesus Christ is a person, not a defined abstract concept, nor an invisible figure of myth. Consequently, he cannot be the same to any two people. People know each other in relationship, both contributing to its aspects and quality, which change over time. The personality of the perceiver is always there when a person assimilates a concept or learns the attributes of some invented supernatural being. But this subjective feature, my personality with relationship to what I know, is not essential to the understanding of an object and may even be seen to impede it. That is to say, if I project my personality into a subject I'm studying, chances are I won't understand it very clearly. But relationship, a personal encounter of two subjects, two individuals, rather than a subject seizing an object, is an important experience in most religious systems, and much sought after by mystics in particular. Dissident Christians, or Christians at variance with the Orthodox point of view, insisted that the person of Christ, the humanity of Christ, demands that the meeting of two people, a direct, personal, and individual encounter, be the root and essence of Christianity, not the mediated encounter of a ritual or the actions of a priest. Now, since one of those two individuals is God incarnate, or a man who became God, there are variations in viewpoint, the individual mystical experience of this direct encounter is the necessary essence, the basis of everyday and universal Christianity from this point of view, that from which one starts, and in relation to which all discursive thought, all dogma, all priesthood, all ritual, all imagery and all symbolism are at best subsidiary things of limited utility and often enough barriers to direct experience which cause real harm. In fact, say the adherents of this point of view, all God's people are priests, and the most fulfilled of them become like Christs themselves. Many of the Paulicians called themselves Christs. Some dissident Christians find it impossible to believe Christ was born as anything other than a full human being, since his flesh was manifestly ours. Depending on whether the human body was seen as good or bad in essence, adherents of this view, that Christ began only as a man and became God, drew varying conclusions about Christ's human nature, some of which we'll look at in a moment. So if we see Christian faith for what it really is, according to the dissident view that I've outlined very briefly, it sets institutional religion and the established church in particular on its head. To know Christ, I do not need a learned priest who has read cosmological texts and learned complex rituals, who can tell me what I must or must not eat and when, or what shapes and places and things are sacred, or what happens after death or at the end of time, and to whom, or even what sort of a person or being he thinks Jesus Christ is. When Christ is, after all, the person with whom I have simply a direct and personal relationship based on the law of love, which was supposed to supplant all the others, of what use can these things possibly be? A learned priest must then impress me as a dissident Christian adhering to this point of view, by degrees, as a bookish antiquarian, obsessed with all sorts of arbitrary superstitions, a man of limited intellect, since he is imparting to me as fact statements on subjects about which he cannot possibly have any experiential or certain knowledge, like the afterlife, and finally, as a manipulating, threatening, even repressive individual on the social level, who is very likely making a living at his fictions rather than doing any real productive work, and this is where dissident Christianity becomes also a social movement and a movement of protest. He is not even a Christian from this point of view, since he has rejected the core for the shell. One may perhaps further distinguish two subcategories amongst these proto-Protestant or dissident Christian groups. The first of the subcategories is puritanical in its tendencies, coupling simplicity of doctrine with a stern and ascetic morality. The magisterial Protestant denominations, like the Puritans and Congregationalists back where I live, fall under this heading. Christ suffered in a world of sin. In emulating him, so must we. The second of these two subgroups seems to me freer and more joyous in its approach, asserting that Christ was a man, so the human body has the potential to be inhabited by divinity, to be Christ-like, or may even be so by its nature. Some of this second kind of Protestant group, like the Quakers, would hold that it already has an inner light, waiting only to be discovered. Thus, for example, in the year 1656, a Quaker leader, James Naylor, rode into the city of Bristol in England, dressed in the way he thought Christ dressed himself, presumably in some sort of white bathrobe, followed by worshiping women. And this scandalized, of course, the established church. The individualism inherent in the view of the world that this second type of Christians espouses also permits, even encourages people to have visions and create cosmologies, theories about the universe of their own. It encourages a kind of spiritual democracy and creativity. Because the first characterization of Christianity, of normative Christianity, that I mentioned above would be called orthodox. Orthodox is a Greek word meaning the right opinion. The second will labor under the stigma of being unorthodox, of being in some ways a wrong opinion, or of being a heresy. Heresy in Greek is a word meaning bad choice. Choice, really, but bad implied. And this heresy is expressed in varying degrees of radicalism, and even though it claims to be the authentic and primordial type of Christianity, even where it has succeeded against self-defined orthodoxy, it retains, by the very name Protestant, being in protest, the memory of its adversarial stance. Protestant movements are protest movements. Even the modern euphemism, alternative, that we find so important with reference to so many things, does not free us of the sense of unequal opposition. An alternative lifestyle is still an alternative to something, which is the normal one, right? Yeah. So it seems to me that each view of the essence of Christianity, Orthodox or Protestant, has some validity, and a term other than heresy or Protestantism ought perhaps to be employed to establish that balance. But in history, these designations require no balance, since they describe a social and historical reality. For the second type, the Protestant type, the antinomian one, the one that goes against established laws, has almost always been revolutionary in its essence, whereas the first has generally been the religion of the establishment and of power. And this was always true in Armenia. The opposition between these two types is not merely one of theology. It is spiritual, intellectual, sentimental, political, and economic. No single point of view or method of investigation would do it full justice over the span of historical time. Søren Kierkegaard described this multiplicity of factors which we find in social conflict in his journals over 100 years ago. He wrote, Even now in 1848 was the year, if you recall, when revolutions galvanized all of Europe. Even now in 1848, it certainly looks as though politics were everything, says Kierkegaard. But it will be seen that the catastrophe corresponds to us and is the obverse of the Reformation. He's referring here to the Protestant Reformation and to Martin Luther. Then, everything pointed to a religious movement, but proved to be political. Now everything points to a political movement, says Kierkegaard, but will become religious. Both kinds of Christianity express dissatisfaction with the world as it is, Orthodox and Protestant, and both look backward to an Edenic state of bliss, to the way things were before Adam was thrown out of the Garden of Eden, and look forward to eschatological redemption, to a change at the end of time. For some heretical movements, social inequality, the state and the established church, are themselves the fall from grace. Without them, we would be back in the Garden of Eden. So purity, in their view, is recoverable in this world through a radical transformation of the things that exist. Now, if such a formulation, the way that virtually every institution is regarded as satanical and is turned on its head, reminds you of William Blake, it should be no surprise, because many of the English poets' ideas about a kind of a democratic, universal priesthood, of visions for everybody, of a church that is satanic and a devil who is divine, of an extravagantly creative cosmology and the Christ-like essence of man, all of these attitudes that Blake espouses in his poems, which form in many ways the foundation of American literature and its visionary quality, can be traced to the influence of radical Protestant sectarianism in 17th century England and its 18th century survivals, in particular a rather charmingly named sect called the Muggletonians, the followers of an inspired visionary named Muggleton. The founders of yet another radical Protestant group who felt much the same way, whom you may have heard of, called the Mormons, who were based in Utah, in this country, seem to have drawn on similar sources, including Muggletonianism, and one of the vectors that brought these ideas to them, to frontier New England when Joseph Smith was born, was Freemasonry. We'll see similar patterns operating in Armenia, an Orthodox church, a dissident church, secret societies providing a pattern and a vector for certain ideas. Let's look at the particular Armenian background out of which Paulicianism, the native Protestantism of the Armenians, emerges. Armenia, on the eve of its conversion in the 4th century to Christianity, was inhabited by diverse peoples practicing a bewildering variety of religions. Zoroastrianism was dominant, particularly amongst the Arsacid kings and the Nakharars, the noble families of the country. There seem to have existed also warlike private groupings, societies, espousing a heroic ethic, who regarded one of the Zoroastrian divinities, Mithra, in Armenian Meher, as their special patron. Roman Mithraism, a system of such martial secret societies, traces its descent to this area, to Armenia and Pontus to the north, and in the Middle Ages, urban associations of young men in the Armenian community called Gdrichavorats Miutyung or Yekhbayrutyung, that is to say associations of the brave or brotherhoods, and similar associations called Javon Mardon amongst the Sunni and Alawi communities of the Armenians' Muslim neighbors, seem to preserve many features of the earlier Mithraic order. Now this is important because a suppressed heresy has to be able to survive underground if it is to continue, and heresies which have a social component also engage in warfare, as the Paulicians were to do. So the previous existence of a system of secret societies in Armenia could have been known to the Paulicians, and their experience drawn into use. Certainly there are precedents for such things in the country, in the particular Armenian setting. Now, a secret society, being secret, is going to attract additional slander because of its secrecy. The universal human assumption being that what is concealed must be shameful. Therefore, descriptions of heresy in Armenia, as almost everywhere else, and particularly, though, in relation to neighboring countries, include the charge of something called extinguishing the lights. All the Paulicians, various other heretics, were supposed to have been chiragamach. They killed the lights. In Persian, chirag kosh. In Turkish, mum sündüren. The lights were turned off so that the practitioners of the sects could indulge in promiscuous orgies, which I leave to your imagination. Distinctions between religious and political dissidents in Anatolia, if indeed they ever really existed at all, are frequently crossed in these descriptions of heresy and possibly in the activities of the heretics themselves. For instance, the Armenian historian Movses Khorenatsi, I won't suggest when he was writing, except that it's early compared to the information to come later, had specifically condemned the Sasanian Persian religious reformer Mazdak, who lived in the 6th century, for teaching that women were to be held in common. That was the most important single feature of Mazdakism that Khorenatsi disapproved of, because it would disrupt the social order and the patterns of inheritance. It was also immoral, yes? And at the other end of the historical spectrum, in 20th century Turkey, communists, especially in eastern Anatolia, are frequently stigmatized by the authorities of being mum sündüren. This is the mythical aspect of their activity that the authorities focus upon to attract hostility toward them. People who extinguish the lights and indulge in orgies. Something I have never seen happen even once in Moscow, and many times I would have liked to see it. And many communists in Turkey come from the Kurdish Alevi community, against which the same calumny has been historically leveled in the past. So you see, there is a continuity of the kinds of accusations leveled against heretics and dissidents, yes, from earliest times down to today. My informant about the Turkish communists is a Zaza Kurd from Varto, north of Mush, who teaches at, he's a microbiologist at Harvard. So, what other religious movements can we point to in Armenia that are of relevance for the beginnings of Paulicianism? The 3rd century religious teacher Mani, whose mother was a member of the Kamsaragan family, an important Nakharar family in Parthia and Armenia, wrote an epistle to the Armenians, a letter to the Armenians, which is mentioned in several different sources independently, and it seems that his religion was firmly founded in the country. One account, which we have in Sogdian from a recently published manuscript, of a mission of his disciple Mar Gabriab to a place called Revan, perhaps Arebanus in southeastern Armenia, seems to me to be based on the legend of the mission of the Christian apostles Thaddeus and Bartholomew to the court of the Armenian king Sanatruk. It's exactly the same story transposed into Manichaean terms. So it would indicate that in order to spread his religion, Mani's disciples used Christian stories and reformulated them in Armenia. The presence of Manichaeism in the country is significant for the study of Christian heresy because rare indeed is the sect that the Orthodox have not derided as Manichaean, often adducing contradictory evidence beneath this rubric of opprobrium. Mani regarded the body and the physical world as creations of an evil spirit. So Christ could not have been fully of the body. Mani was a dualist, much like the Persian Zoroaster, but a dualist in reverse. Zoroaster believed that God, Ahura Mazda, created the world good, and he had an evil opponent named Ahriman. Mani believed that it was the creator of the world who was evil, and that good, you see, was an alien spirit who had implanted in our fallen bodies a spark of light which is trapped and has to be released. Notice the image of the spark of light that I've referred to again, that everyone has the spark of light within him. But there are fundamental differences. See? Some Protestant sects would believe that the body is good and has a spark of light in it, which makes it even better. Others believe it has a spark of light which has to be released somehow. According to Mani's doctrine, the world is bad, material reality drags us down, and the point is, through virtue and through knowledge of the truth, to escape. Mani believed himself to be the inheritor not only of Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, and all the other religions ever practiced, but of Christianity as well. So he has a Christology, an approach to Christ's nature, and says that Christ only seemed to be a physical human being. He wasn't really one, and he only seemed to die on the cross. He didn't really die there. This is also the Christology of Islam. And we refer to it as docetist, from a Greek verb meaning to seem. But since Christ did not really die on the cross, there is no reason for us to revere it as Orthodox Christians and all Armenian Christians do. In Mani's view, the cross as an object is evil, an instrument of death, and not the vehicle of salvation. The Paulicians were Docetists and violently rejected the Armenian worship of Khachkars, destroying these objects, the stone crosses, wherever they found them. But Mani was also a visionary. He created an elaborate cosmology with many heavens and emanations of creation, of divinities, and other things. So this extravagant aspect of the intellect, at least, was also Manichaean. It was seen as a kind of intellectual liberalism, and so the word Manichaean was employed to condemn excessively liberal practices as well. Paulicians and other sectarians could thus be attacked as Manichaeans to whichever one of the contradictory subgroups of dissident Christianity they belonged. They could say yes and be a Manichaean, or say no and be one anyway. It didn't matter. Mani's combination of features has an internal logic, but these accusations often do not. What we have to do when we hear the charge Manichaean then against a heretic in Armenia is to figure out what it means in the given circumstance, or whether it's just a simple way of saying, I don't agree with you. Also in Armenia, the cults of various Semitic gods of Syria and Mesopotamia flourished in symbiosis with Iranian religion. And there were even older Anatolian strains. The Syrian god Bel, in one inscription, for example, from Nev Shehir, the western boundaries of the country, is married to the female personification of Mazda worship, the Iranian divinity called Daina, vision. So here we have a Semito-Iranian marriage, and the historian Khorenatsi refers to a god, Torkangeh, whose name includes both Tarchuntas, a Hittite word, and Nergal, a Mesopotamian one. And this Torkangeh, who is already two people, is in fact a third as well, because he's the Armenian Cyclops. He's the Armenian equivalent of Polyphemus in the epic traditions of the country. So such a rich blend of traditions of the pagan past inspired Armenian writers on heresy to create equally fantastic and eclectic genealogies of heresy, blending Iranian demons with biblical characters, Mani himself, the Paulicians, aspects of Greek mythology like the dog Scylla of Scylla and Charybdis in the Odyssey, and various other heresies which don't seem to have been practiced too widely in Armenia at all, and some which were, like the charming Papuzians. Ever heard of them? Oh, well, there were Papuzians in Armenia too. I won't go into them, but I refer you to my article in Revue des Études Arméniennes of this last issue, which is an Armenian genealogy of heresies. The Papuzians were followers of a lady named Quintilla, who believed that Christ was a woman, but then turned into a man in order to visit her, which seems to be a lot of unnecessary permutations. And there were many other aspects of their rituals which I won't describe. I have respect for the delicacy of your ears. So just as pre-Christian Armenia teemed with the strange beings of alien faiths, so were the heresies, which were believed to have some of their roots in the pagan past, believed to encompass them all. Heresy was at once a mistaken understanding of Christianity and a dangerous survival of paganism. This is a contradictory view in logic, but it's quite possible in history for one sect to have both features, to have at once pagan characteristics, but to present a critique of the existing Christian orthodoxy. Yet another facet of early Christian Armenia, which is of importance for us to consider, which is the existence of critical atheism. What if you don't believe any of this? Armenian students flocked to lectures in Greek philosophy and rhetoric and law at Antioch and other centers of Hellenistic culture. They were the majority of the students of the great teacher Libanius in the 4th century. Some of his other students included St. John Chrysostom and the Roman Emperor Julian the Apostate, who attempted to restore paganism in Rome. The attitude of the Roman-educated upper classes towards religion has been best summed up in The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Edward Gibbon says that to the rulers, to the philosophers, I should say, to the philosophers, all religions are equally false. To the rulers, they're all equally useful, and to commoners, they're all equally true. Many Armenians were to be numbered amongst the philosophers, who thought that any kind of religion, any belief in any sort of supernatural reality, was nonsense. Yes? So, and as elsewhere in Anatolia, diverse forms of early Christianity existed in Armenia alongside the established church, whose condemnations of heresy are as old as Armenian written literature itself. The Council of Shahapivan in 447, for instance, condemned Messalianism, mutzachneyutun. It comes from the Syriac word metzale, meaning somebody who prays. Ordering that heretics, even women and children, be hamstrung. This meant that that a tendon be severed in their legs behind their knees. Branded on the forehead with the sign of a fox, and confined for 7 years to leper colonies. So much for the image of Christian love that the church presented to dissidents. And the historian Ghazar Parpetsi refers in his writings to what he calls the heresy of the land of Armenia, which is not named for any teacher. Paulicianism itself is first mentioned by name when the Council of Divin condemns it in 555. The name is attested in both Greek and Armenian. There are various etymologies offered, but the most plausible is that it is named after its founder, whether or not it derives from the heresy that has no founder. Pavrik little Paul, with the diminutive suffix ik that we still use, like Mairik, Hairik, others, lots of them, Hovik, etc. Pavlik. Yeah. Pavlik. The os is often removed when putting an ending on Armenian words. Ovkianos, but Ovkiani, and so on. Classical. Yeah? So, what does the Council of Divin say the Paulicians did? They took the bread of offering, this is the host from the Badarak, to their own places and offered it up with their own hands. This is a democratic treatment of the Mass that one would expect of an anti-hierarchical group of the kind I've outlined above. They didn't believe in priestly intercession and thought that whatever Christ did, they could simply imitate themselves. The sect undoubtedly originated in Armenia, since various independent sources associate its beginnings with the country, with Shamshat, Samosata, and Mananahi. These are two different parts of Armenia, so it was very widespread from the beginning. But its origins probably predate this first reference by some centuries, and it may have its roots in an early form of Christianity, much earlier than the time of the Council of Divin or even Pavlik himself. Within a century after its first mention and presumed suppression in Armenia, Paulicianism spreads to Byzantium, but encounters opposition, and many of its adherents return, joining forces in the 7th century with the iconoclasts of Caucasian Albania, Akhvank. Iconoclasts are people who don't believe in sacred pictures and their efficacy, and regard such things as idols. The Armenian Church takes a moderate view in these areas, which is perhaps one of the reasons that iconoclasm arose there before it did in Byzantium. Since, as you know, Armenians don't put icons in their homes the way Russian and Greek Orthodox people do, but do have sacred pictures, and certainly do consider the cross an object of special power and reverence, Armenia is sort of in between people who would have no icons at all, and those who think that icons are absolutely imbued with supernatural power. So Armenia is the logical place for an iconoclastic movement to start, and whether it is or not, it did. Because Vertanes Kertoch, as you probably know, right, it writes a treatise, Hagagus Batgera Martits, concerning those who war against images, iconoclasts, in this period. And the Paulicians joined these iconoclasts immediately, seeing in them allies, at least in one respect. When in the 8th century a new power appeared on the block, the Muslim Arabs, the Paulicians sought an alliance with them too. They were iconoclastic, and they were also Docetist and adoptionist in their beliefs about Christ. So it was thought that Islamic doctrine was compatible with Paulician conceptions. But Paulicians' behavior was not entirely consistent in this area, for many of them supported an abortive rising of the Armenian Nakharars, the local nobility, against the Arabs in the late 8th century. This is the uprising that culminated in the disastrous Battle of Bagrevant in 772. One reason for this might have been personal loyalties. After all, we know that many heretics in Armenia were members of the Nakharar class. The canons of Shah Ivan in 447 against the Matzichnyaik, the Massalians, specify that heretics belonging to noble families should not be allowed by their relatives to seek sanctuary in their remote and inaccessible castles. The idea being, presumably, that some heretics belonging to whether Mamikonyan or Artsruni houses, when they felt that they were in danger of arrest, would simply go to their remote fortresses and hole up there, which was a regular practice of the Nakharars on many occasions, one reason why Armenia was so rarely unified. Yes? If a Nacharar disagreed with anything that the central power was doing, he would go to his castle and sit in high dudgeon, wait for the king to die or something. So heretics did the same thing. And if all of the Nacharars rose up, presumably Paulician Nacharars would side with them and the hell with what they thought of obscure points of doctrine, because they were also nationalistic. The Armenians had acquired by the 6th century a strong sense of their separate identity after the war of Vartan Mamikonian against the Sasanians, who had sought to reimpose Zoroastrianism in the country. That war produced, as you know, the great history and martyrology of Yerisha Vartabed, and the uprising against the Arabs seems to have been an event that galvanized the national imagination in a similar way, because it was the event that crystallized into one narrative the heroic songs that have come down to us as the epic Sasnazoresh, the epic of Sasun. It was as much a formative event in many ways as Vartanants had been. Some Paulicians, for whatever reason, stayed loyal to their Arab allies, or simply continued to live in Arab lands, or returned later on to the alliance, because we know that much later, in the 11th century, Paulicians fought alongside the Arabs against the Crusaders. But with the failure of the 8th century Armenian uprising, many Paulicians fled yet again into the Byzantine Empire, where this time they encountered a policy of some tolerance, but that came to an end. With the help of the Arabs of Malatya, they built a fortress at Tefrike, Turkish Divriği, Western Armenian Divrik, near Sivas. And from this center, they threatened the rest of the empire as far as Constantinople. This town became the center of the sect, which resisted the Orthodox by force of arms until its capture in 893 AD by Basil I. After 1100, the city became a capital of one of the Manjukakid emirates, but it seems that Armenians continued to reside there, for the architectural historian Thomas Sinclair finds that the portals and decorations of the 13th century Mosque of Divrik reflect the influence of Armenian manuscript art. There is no documentary evidence of the continued residence of Paulician Armenians in Divrik after its initial destruction. And the number of Armenians in the place must have been augmented in any case by other communities from the east, Vaspuragan particularly, and other regions, because if you recall, after the Seljuk invasions, a great many Armenians migrated from this area to the district of Sivas in particular, along with Senekerim Artsuni. This will be relevant shortly. But there is no reason why Paulicians should not have continued to live in their former capital, keeping their meetings and their beliefs as secret as possible. Before the 1915 genocide, about 2,000 Armenian families lived in the Aigetach garden district of the town. I think that this figure really means 2,000 Armenians rather than families, actually, and had two churches and a monastery. In 1878, this is also significant, keep it in mind for what follows, Bishop Garakin Servanstians, on a visit to Divrik, noted that a philanthropic society formed long ago, Achkadachnam Ungerutyun Mahanuts Gazmial, was established in the community. So, after Basil's campaign in the 9th century, some Paulicians remained in the Balkans, where their teachings influenced the priest Bogomil, and the heresy named after him endured in the region for centuries. Bosnia was mentioned. What little art we have that can somehow be associated with the Paulicians is Bogomil sculpture, Bogomil funerary sculpture in Bosnia and Serbia. There are several monographs on it. You can't really deduce very much from it, but it's quite beautiful. It mostly comes from the 15th century with inscriptions in Serbo-Croatian. I once got a letter from somebody who claimed he was a Bogomil, but I dismissed it. Maybe I shouldn't have. In any case, I wrote back to him, and then he got scared and didn't write to me anymore. Bogomils. In Bulgaria, and the words Bogomil and Bulgaria yield a French word, which has come down to us in English, pardon my saying so, as bugger, an act, yes, which was often associated with heretics. Yes? Remember that I showed how illicit sexual practices and heresy were often paired in the popular imagination. So next time you hear an Englishman use this very popular verb, you can explain to him that it has remote Armenian origins. And he should be more respectful. So, and it exerted an influence in its turn on the Cathars and Albigensians. But these are areas that I don't want to enter into. It would take a lot of time, and I am not an expert in Western European heresy. Other Paulicians returned east into Armenia. This is what's more relevant to our discussion, where Sumbat of Zarehavan revived the sect, and it now came to bear the name of the new center from which it was propagated, Tondrak, in the district of Abahunik. So the Paulicians came to be called Tondraketsis, Tondrakites. Members of various classes joined this sect. Prince Verver of Shiri and Bishop Hovsep of Hark, for instance, around the year 1000, represent the nobility and clergy. Armenian clerics and political leaders, St. Gregory of Narek in the 10th century, Grigor Magistros in the 11th, St. Nerses Shnorhali in the 12th, all wrote against the Tondraketsis in various parts of the country, at the monastery of Kachav in Mok, at Tulail in Taron, at Kashe on the Araks near Julfa, in Cilicia, all over Armenia in short, and persecuted them. After the 12th century, very little is heard of the Tondraketsis. Dissident religious movements continued to thrive in Armenia, however, both amongst Armenians and their Muslim neighbors, and we should never underestimate the interaction between these two, which was very considerable down to very recent times. In the 13th century, with Mongol invasions ravaging Central Asia, various extremist Muslim sectarians from Bactria and Khwarezmia, this is the area of modern Western Afghanistan and the region east of the Aral Sea, what was the Aral Sea, migrated west into Anatolia. The most famous of these is a man whose name is Jalaluddin al-Balkhi, better known to us as Jalaluddin Rumi. Maulana. Yeah, the great Sufi poet who came from Balkh, from ancient Bactria, present-day Mazar-e-Sharif, and settled in Konya. Konya, the ancient city of Iconium, is Rome, Eastern Roman Empire. So he's called Rumi, and he's adduced by some of my colleagues as an example of Turkish humanism. And he was as Turkish as I'm Chinese. He was an Iranian poet from Central Asia, and he was part of this movement westwards of Sufis and others, yes? Now, these sectarians merged with dissonant and mystical movements, which were already in existence there amongst the Turkish population, such as the Kalandars, the Haidaris, and the Abdal. And as part of their program, they tried to effect social changes in favor of the lower classes and undertook military campaigns in support of these. For example, the followers of Baba Ishaq conquered Tokat and Amasya for a time. Both of these were cities with very large Armenian populations. So it is impossible to exclude the likelihood of mutual influence between Christians and Muslims in the Middle Ages in the area of religio-social dissidence. In fact, it seems to me to be too obvious to argue for it. The historian Zakaria Sarkavak, writing in the late 17th century, reports that 100 years before his time, there had been a certain Mechlu, an Armenian named Mechlu, honored by Muslims with the honorific Baba, father, and by Armenian Christians with Vardabed, a doctor of divinity. Mechlu is a Turco-Persian term which means he who has a nail. Mech is a nail. Mich. And it seems to refer to the spike with which he stabbed and killed his enemies. He came from Achvank, preaching that one might attain the kingdom of heaven by killing celibate monks, priests, and bishops. He thought that celibacy was a particular evil and that it should be suppressed at all costs. Mechlu adhered to a life of abstemious simplicity, however, in all other respects, and kept 12 strong men, topuzavors, they were called, around him as his apostles. So here we have someone else masquerading as a Christ figure, yes? And emphasizing the humanity, the rightness of our basic physical humanity because he opposed celibacy. So you see there's a continuity. Okay. At New Julfa, the Armenian district of Esfahan in Iran, he found supporters amongst rich and poor alike. He read to them from a kind of compendium he possessed. Girk Mijoavatsu is what Zakaria calls it. And then Khachatur of Julfa reports on the movement in New Julfa in 1642, led by a tailor named either Thomas or Tumik. Again, we find this diminutive used, Little Thomas. And compare Pavlik earlier. He declared Jesus was a man and Mary was no virgin. He denied the power of the cross. He rejected the priesthood, together with the rite of communion, and did not believe in Judgment Day. His detractors regarded him much as their ancestors had seen the ancient Iranian monster Ajdahak, with whom Khorenatsi compared Mazdak centuries earlier. Ajdahak was the embodiment of both evil religion and misrule in the Iranian conception, from whose shoulders snakes sprouted. He's called Zahak in the Shahnameh, and he's always shown this way. So, Tumik's enemies saw him walking down the street and beheld Yergu Devi Vera Yerguts Usots Nastyalen Yevdachosian Nosa. 2 demons are sitting on his 2 shoulders, and he converses with them. These can be compared to the 2 snakes, and also, of course, to the Muslim belief, quite a widespread and popular one, that on your left shoulder sits a devil offering you evil temptations, and on your right shoulder sits an angel offering you good advice. It seems to be a confluence of the 2. These various beliefs from the 16th and 17th centuries are very much like those held by the Paulicians and the Tundra-Ketsis who perpetuated their teachings. They were adoptionists and considered Christ to have come into being, to have been born merely human, only later to have become filled with divinity at the time of his baptism, donning again the primal raiment of light that Adam had lost in Eden. Baptism amongst the Paulicians was undertaken only when the believer was old enough to be a fully conscious adult. Any individual amongst them had the potential to be filled with the divine essence, to return to the ideal Adamic state. And men who were called Christs. The Paulicians rejected the icon. The Tundra-Ketsis rejected the icon of the cross. By spreading wide his arms, one of their elect said that he became a living cross. They rejected the priesthood and its rites, performing the sacraments themselves after taking the bread of offering to their meeting places. They denied celibacy. Their detractors, at least, report that there were different levels of knowledge amongst the Tundra-Ketsis, depending upon how far one advanced in the sect. Grigor Magistros Pahlavuni, for instance, says that an inner circle amongst them, Gata Relaguink, the perfected ones, and this seems to mirror the usage of the term perfecti that we find in Western Europe, were Epicurean, naturalist, nihilist, and without hope. And you recall that the idea of a kind of nihilistic atheism existed in the intellectual climate of Armenia from a very early period, yes, amongst the philosophers. It existed in the medieval Arab world too. Abu Mansur al-Ghazali talks about it in his Al-Munqidh min ad-Dalal, the deliverance from error. He says that one of the forces ranged against Islam is that of the philosophers who deny that there is any spiritual reality at all. Okay? So Magistros, who lives at about the same time as Al-Ghazali, is repeating this charge, but in an Armenian context. The rest, he continues, were taught like the Manichaeans, even though they officially anathematized the latter. And to the world, the Tondraketsis put on a show of being Christians. There doesn't seem to be much evidence of such hierarchical attitudes having existed at all amongst the Paulicians. Quite to the contrary, their denial of sacerdotal prerogative seems to have sprung from a democratic impulse to spread wide both sanctity and knowledge. And one sees a parallel to this in the popularization of Hermeticism in 17th century England. This body of knowledge contributed significantly to the development of various radical libertarian Protestant ideologies there, like Muggletonianism that I mentioned earlier, that contributed to Blake or the Mormons. And this popularized knowledge itself became, as a recent historian has described it, a vehicle of popular empowerment, breaking down old monopolies of intellectual authority and privilege. What Magistros says about the Paulicians would be just the opposite, that they had a secret doctrine, a not-so-secret doctrine, and an everyday doctrine, for which there's no evidence. So how are we to understand what he says? It seems to me that there were various attitudes that actually existed amongst different Paulicians, depending on the level of their education or their personal feelings, given the relative intellectual freedom that they encouraged. So that some of them may indeed have believed that Christ was merely a man who was an inspired teacher. Others believed that he was a spirit who was in the material world to warn us against its blandishments. And yet others believed themselves fully to be Christians, but to believe in a reformed kind of Christianity. In other words, Magistros's ideas may reflect simply the intellectual diversity that existed amongst the Tondraketsis, something which would have been anathema to anyone who assumes that dogma is a foundation for Christian faith. So, in the aftermath of the Russian conquest of the Khanate of Yerevan in 1828, a number of Turkish Armenians emigrated east into liberated Christian territory. Amongst them were 25 Tondraketsi families from a village called Jorm in Khenus, who settled in the village of Arkheveli in Shirak, in the area of modern Leninagan, Kumairi. Their proselytizing came to the attention of one Bishop Garabed, who reported to the Mother See of the Armenian Church at Echmiadzin in February 1937 that they disbelieved, 1837, I'm sorry, in 1937 there was no synod to report to, they were all in Siberia, that they disbelieved in the divinity of Christ, rejecting the cross, infant baptism and chrismatic oil, the virginity of Mary, the intercession of the saints, and the various fasts. Those who did not believe as they did not regard as Christians at all, with the exception of the Niemetsni, that is to say the Germans, millenarians from Württemberg who had settled in the Caucasus. And in fact, the Tondraketsi Paulician heresy has its closest analogs in the German Anabaptist movement and in early Unitarianism, and maybe not so early Unitarians. They had a particular and tenacious hatred of celibate monks. They kept the Ten Commandments regarding the Old Testament as Astvatzashunsh, the God-inspired book, but they had a book of doctrine of their own as well. This is the book that Frederick Honevier published and translated, which the Armenian Synod confiscated. Its title, The Key of Truth, Armenian Banalicha Shmartyan, alludes to the knowledge, the gates to which Satan had locked, which its author was opening up again, and it contains an exposition of Paulician Tantrikite doctrine and baptismal ritual, which was to be undertaken for adults only. The volume the Synod obtained was a manuscript copied in 1782 of a much older work, possibly composed by Sambad of Zarehavan himself. Its owner had excised certain passages, in the baptismal ritual particularly, apparently out of fear when he knew it was to be seized. The Armenian clergy appealed to the Russian civil authorities to suppress the Paulicians, but apart from a token fine, absolutely nothing was done to them at all, because, as you will recall, the Russian Orthodox Church regarded the Armenian Orthodox as heretics. Yes? What sauce for the goose? So, the Paulicians simply continued to exist to the best of our knowledge in Archveli, and they vanished from the pages of history. Perhaps some are still there, but there is no notice of them whatsoever anywhere. In late March 1995, an Armenian friend of mine, Mr. Jack Bournazian, originally from Massachusetts, but now living in Chula Vista, a suburb of San Diego, mentioned to me in conversation that he knew a Paulician. I reacted to this much in the same way that I might if a guest in my house told me he'd seen a Tyrannosaurus Rex in the bathroom. However, on April 7th, 1995, together with my colleague Armand Royan, we visited Mr. Bournazian's home and met Mr. Robert Lyon, born Khachatur Aslanyan, at Divrig on the 10th of January, 1901. The interview was videotaped by Armen, has been augmented by several subsequent letters containing written replies to my questions, transcribed by Mr. Bournazian, and 2 audio-taped interviews, one from 1984 and the other from this year. Mr. Lyon declares he is a Paulician. His father's family's name was originally Antaramyan, and they came from Tarva, a town near Sivas, which had an large Armenian community. The place, he said to me, was famous for its millers, and his great-grandfather was summoned from there by the Turkish authorities in Divrik to repair a mill that had been damaged in an earthquake. When I returned to Cambridge, I was able to verify this much information independently. Tavra, to the north of Sivas, is a place rich in streams running down from the Mairako Mountains that powered many mill wheels when the Armenians lived there. Most of the people were millers, avoreban, and most of the men of the place used to travel some distance from their village to work on or repair other people's water mills. According to tradition, Tavra, pronounced thus in Western Armenian but spelled Davra with a da, not a dun, derives its name from Davtakyuch, or Tavtakyuch, David's village, and was built by King Sennacherib's son David after the mass migration from Vaspuragan. Rather than pay for the work that Mr. Antaramyan had done and allow the miller to return to Tavra, the Turkish authorities gave him the mill, a house, and an acre of alfalfa, as well as many fruit trees, mulberries, apricots, apples, and plums, and he received the honorific Aslan, lion, hence the present surname Aslanyan, which was anglicized when the family moved to New England. His grandfather married the daughter of the wealthiest Armenian in Divrik. When Khachatur, that is to say Bob, Robert Lyon, was born, it was his paternal grandmother who raised him, bathed him, cooked for him, and read the Bible to him. She was a liberal woman and used to say, "Every normal person has 2 eyes to see, 2 ears to hear, and a head to think, but most people use none of these, only the tongue." So she was a critical, sarcastic, and open-minded observer of the human scene. Grandmother was the Paulician in the family and taught him to be good, not to lie, cheat, mistreat animals, or eat animal food, but only fruit and vegetables. Now, one recalls that the Manichaeans were vegetarian, although the Paulicians were not necessarily. But vegetarianism was a necessary feature of the Manichaean faith. The Manichaeans believed, you see, that every body is part of the material world created by evil that holds down the spirit. If you eat meat, you're weighed down. If you eat fruit, you're less so, especially cucumbers and melons. These two, said Mani, contain a great many light elements, and they help you rise up swiftly into the Milky Way. So, literally, he said this. She was a humble woman, but held the churches in contempt. For had not Christ taught all men were brothers? Paulicianism is based upon Christianity, said Mr. Lyon, in heated tones, but, and I quote, rejects the falsehoods of the Christian religion. Christians raise armies. The priests bless them before they go forth to kill. And the man's voice became full of power and anger as he decried the cruelty and stupidity of the church establishment and its adherents. Something I've heard Armenian Orthodox Christians do as well. Christ himself was, I quote, an ordinary human being who was a representative of God, unquote, a good teacher. Mr. Lyon does not accept the Immaculate Conception and states simply that Jesus was Mary's andranik child, his firstborn child. Yeah? And this carries also something of the feeling that he was the strongest of them. A few weeks ago, an oral informant reported to me what an old Armenian lady had told him about Christ's birth, which seems to be a mixture of folk belief and the same kind of slightly heretical, not slightly, very heretical doctrine. She told me that Joseph, Mary's husband, was a hurya and really incapable of fathering a real strong boy. So a Mamikonian came and did the job. So there we are. This is the real story. Yes? Anyway, I found it interesting. Mr. Lyon added that the Paulicians in Divrig, used to say quick prayers before meals to God, not to Christ. And they did cross themselves, he said. But recall, the Tundraketsis used to simply spread their arms wide and say, now I become the cross. So crossing oneself wasn't the same thing as killing a bird and dashing its blood on a khachkar, for instance. Yes? Or invoking the Holy Cross. It was different, yes? And this grace before meals could simply be a standard reference to the Armenian grace Chashaosu Chawityam, which just invokes Der. It doesn't say Christos as such, so this could be what they said. Yeah? But this isn't clear. The Paulicians of Divrik, as good Armenians, did accept the cross as the symbol of their people, but within limits, because Mr. Lyon went on to say, I quote, why would God as a father send his son to be humiliated and suffer and die on the cross? Why would a father do that to his son? Unquote. So he concludes it is wrong to offer reverence to the cross. Quote, we rejected symbolism. Reverence for the cross was another gimmick by church leaders to impress the simple masses. It helped to make the religious service a better show. Unquote. In an interview taped for Mr. Bournazian in 1984, when his memory was clearer, Mr. Lyon declares Paulicianism to be pre-Christian in its remote origins, apparently to account somewhat for its dualism, again a Manichaean feature of which the Paulicians are always accused, but which is not evident in their written texts. He says, there are two forces in the universe. One is immortal, eternal, and unchanging spiritual force, the light of the sun, God. His grandmother turned to the sun in prayer every morning and spoke, he reports, of the Aravordik, the children of the sun, with whom some writers, notably Daniel of Torizio, identify the Paulicians, the Fili Isolis, he calls them. But they were different, says Mr. Lyon, and lived in simply another place. In fact, what we know of the children of the sun is that they're the remnant of an old Zoroastrian sect, which has undergone a great deal of change and who vanished completely. The second force, the other force, is material, temporary, and always changing. The body, which is itself evil, lives, ages, and dies, and rivers run, change their courses, and dry up. The aim of life is to care for the spirit, not so much the body. We have the choice of following the laws of the spirit or becoming slaves to the material world. And then I quote him, God has nothing to do with this material world. God didn't create this material world. God created the spirit that dwells in man and all living things. So he combines, it seems, a profound respect for all life with a rejection of materialism. Because God is wholly good, he does not condemn anyone to hell at death. Such a result is our own choice, and in the hereafter, those who are evil perceive their folly. Also strikingly Manichaean, and at some variance with the sources on the Paulicians, is Mr. Lyon's demonization of the Old Testament, which he calls an evil book or even toilet paper in one interview. Abraham would have killed Isaac, and he sold his own wife. Mr. Lyon finds nothing good in Abraham. He wonders why the Jews should represent themselves as the chosen people when they're no better than anybody else. The book is just a lot of propaganda, and there's no point in anybody else retaining it. It's a national kind of propagandistic work of literature book. This is a Manichaean view too. And many early Christian sectarians regarded the gospel not just as the completion of the Old Testament, but as the rejection of it. They saw the God of the Old Testament as a violent and evil being who created the material world, and Christ as its redeemer. Yes? So this seems to be a very archaic belief. Mr. Lyon remembers there having been about 500 Armenian families in Divrig, which would bear out the figure of 2,000 people, more or less, that I mentioned earlier on from the published sources, and 2 Orthodox churches in the upper and lower parts of the town, respectively. There were other Paulicians in Divrig, he says. They prayed separately and alone, but sometimes got together, some 6 families at a time, at various private houses, often his family home where his grandmother lived. These meetings were not advertised. They discussed whether a family needed help, and if so, went and looked after them. You noticed Servanstians's reference to a kind of philanthropic tradition in the town. This may not, of course, be the same thing, but it's interesting nonetheless. Paulicians were not opposed to private property, but did not believe in an excess of it. His grandmother had a scroll which he kept in a cabinet together with some other books. It was in Armenian, and sometimes, Mr. Lyon recalls, a man or a woman came over to read it. Now, since grandmother was able to read, it seems, I had the impression that this man or woman was conducting a kind of ceremony. Though Mr. Lyon does not now remember what the scroll was called and names it simply God's Word, Mr. Bournazian told me that in the past he had referred to it as the key, by which nothing other can be meant than the Tonraketsi document Paulicians Martusyan, discussed earlier. It was a different book, he remembers still, from the Bible. Mr. Lyon also recalled in the past that his grandmother had called herself a Paulician, that she had used the term. He does not know the word Tonraketsi, however, but says it rings a bell. His knowledge of the history of the Paulicians and of the Armenian Church seems to have been culled from books read long ago and embellished by imagination or oral tradition. One cannot safely say which, but he tells the story with an emotion not to be found in any book. How the Paulicians detested slavery, how they sought an alliance with the Arabs, how they marched to the shores of the Aegean, seized Ephesus, and came within sight of Constantinople itself, and how their glorious capital, Divrig, was destroyed in an earthquake. He refuses to acknowledge that Basil destroyed it. Mr. Lyon's father had gone to America to work around the turn of the century and returned to Turkey in the wake of the 1908 revolution, which had kindled hopes of a better life for the minorities of the Ottoman Empire, particularly the Armenians. But there was a massacre of Armenians in Cilicia in 1909, dashing those hopes, and the family left Divrig to hide in the hills until the turbulence died down. The elder Mr. Aslanyan became alarmed, also his son reports, by the talk of Armenian revolutionaries about independence, which he feared would provide the Ottoman government with a pretext for further massacres. So in 1912, he decided to take his immediate family, little Khachatur and his mother and sister, to America. They boarded the last ship out of Constantinople to Greece before the outbreak of the Balkan War, leaving Mr. Aslanyan's grandmother behind. The letters stopped arriving shortly after they had come to the U.S., and together with all of Mr. Lyon's living relatives left at home in the Holocaust of 1915. The Aslanyan family translated its name to English in Lynn, Massachusetts. Khachatur, now Robert, worked in a shoe factory there and on a farm near Boston. He attended Boston University, Hastings Law School, and later on even Fort Worth Bible College in Texas, where he met Baptists and at first liked their teachings since they seemed to resemble the Paulicianism he had learned at home. But when he once mentioned the latter, it caused a very considerable stir amongst historians of the church. The dinosaur metaphor I use seems to be a very durable one. They were astonished and didn't believe the evidence of their eyes. Since Armenians settling in America at the turn of the century had enough trouble without talking about religion, Mr. Lyon maintained a judicious privacy thereafter, abandoned the practice of law, since in his view it is based in America on lying and cheating, but knew farming from Divrig, and moved to San Diego, where he opened a tree nursery and became prosperous. He gave occasional free sermons at the Congregational Church in Chula Vista, and as a patriotic Armenian helped to found the Armenian Church in San Diego. But he never abandoned his Paulician convictions, which he expresses to this day with vigor and eloquence. He is retired now, and his memory is beginning to lapse, but he is bright-eyed and humorous. His Paulicianism carries over, as one might expect in religious dissidents as we've surveyed it, into American politics. He describes himself as a free thinker and in 1934 worked for Upton Sinclair's election campaign. Though the strongly Manichaean features of his beliefs may represent a side of Paulicianism its enemies always asserted was there, but is little documented in the sources, most of his testimony accords well with what is known from the Key of Truth and other texts about the doctrines of the Paulicians and the Tundraketsis who came after them. Rejection of the Orthodox priesthood and its rites, rejection of the absolute divinity of Christ, insistence upon simplicity in prayer, and belief in the inherent dignity of the human spirit trapped in the material world. This modern Paulician would be no stranger amongst medieval Anabaptists, 17th century Quakers, or 19th century Unitarians. Indeed, the ancient, native, Armenian, liberal Protestantism he learnt at his grandmother's knee in distant Divrig is one of the sources of all these, of the liberal tradition itself. There may yet be a few Tundraketsis in the present-day Armenian Republic, in Chirag, and perhaps even elsewhere. But they will have to have survived civil war and famine, the Stalin terror and its suppression of all religion, the privations of World War II, and the 1988 earthquake. It may well be that Bob Lyon the 95-year-old gentleman in a neat dark suit, called by his friends the Patriarch of Chula Vista, a loving family man, a pillar of the Armenian community, and a liberal American, is also the last of the Paulicians. Thank you.
Well, I don't think we're going to let you sit down much, James. Would you like to answer some questions?
If I can.
If you can. Okay, let's go to it. After about 60 seconds of sitting down, you might as well not try it. Come right over.
Yes.
Go right ahead. Question, please.
Please.
The details that are necessary to support the views of the Paulicians and Tondrakians. I admire all the details that you have. With the struggle that I have with the things the central thesis is that Christianity is not lived out or acted out or did not come out of vacuum. It was a reaction or interpretation of a given record, Old Testament and New Testament. So there was a revealed word, so we cannot say honestly, I mean, we can justify it, but we cannot say that heresies is as much as they were, as much as on the right track as orthodoxy is. It's a matter of interpretation. The course of the scripture is quite strongly in support of who Christ is, about his divinity, about the world, about evil, body and the soul. To an extent, there are clear-cut cores. So, and that's the reason I believe that heresies have died out, whether it be Tondrakians or Paulicians throughout. I mean, they have dwindled, and new heresies are always arising. So, but I appreciate a lot of things that.
Yeah, perhaps I should clarify what my intentions were. I don't have a hidden agenda of promoting Paulicianism or of reviving it. As I read about it, and as I met Mr. Lyon and talked to him, I developed a strong sympathy for it and for many of its ideas, and for not so much the extreme Christian heresies as for another strain of Christianity very different from the one I usually deal with. I'm involved mostly in research with Naregatsi, who wrote against the Tondrakatsis. An Armenologist has to be open to almost every manifestation of culture in Armenian life in general, and I found it easier to understand not only what Mr. Lyon had to say, but the living spirit of how he said it, what he felt, when I tried to recreate the emotional life and to search for the sources of the spiritual inspirations of the Paulicians to whom he belonged. If you remember at the beginning of the lecture, I suggested that what was interesting to me was not only his belief, but his sentiment. Human beings don't operate as computers. They're inspired, driven by their feelings as well as by their analyses of their situation. Social struggles come into being out of a perceived sense of injustice. This has a strong emotional component. I also tried to suggest, apparently not as effectively as I wanted to, that the word heresy is inaccurate. That in fact what we have in the Christian tradition is a wide variety of beliefs from the very beginning, some of which, because of their hierarchical bent, their organizational character, tend to be the particular form of Christianity that is dominant in history, others of which tend to place themselves in a confrontational Protestant position with respect to the dominant majority all the time, as a kind of a permanent critic of the shortcomings of the established church. However, one should point out that most Americans are Protestants, and thus the world really is now a Protestant world. It is dominated by a Protestant point of view, a technology evolved by Protestants. And yet we still speak of Protestant versus Orthodox. There's always that sense. And what I wanted to explore was why established churches, even when they're not in power of a certain kind, are called Orthodox, that we almost instinctively call them this, and others, even when they reach a position of power, are Protestant. It has more to do with their existential point of view than with their influence at the moment.
Would you agree, excuse me for interrupting, would
No.
you agree that after a certain point, a viewpoint would cease to align with Christianity and with Christian doctrine as it is given, with the scriptures or historical interpretation of the scriptures?
Sure, yeah. But it's very hard to draw that line, because the adherents of a given point of view would be loath to draw it. Let's take, for example, the established church where I live, the Unitarian Church at Harvard University, which absolutely and unqualifiedly denies the divinity of Christ, and yet regards itself as a Christian church. Yeah? Or the various Puritan churches. Armenians define themselves traditionally as Chachabasht. This is the old word that we find in various places. Not Christos Abasht, rarely Sun and everywhere else. Yet, when the builder of a New England church in the 17th century put a cross on the steeple, he was exiled to Connecticut as an idolater. Yeah? Now, if the Puritans weren't Christians, well, you go tell them they're not. So, these definitions are very fluid. I guess.
I remember something about the elder.
Yeah.
I don't remember the Armenian word for them in the Panali, but they're elders.
Yeah.
Is that supposed to be a group of, not priests, but at least higher level, like the Mormons have, a sort of higher level people who had higher knowledge?
Yeah, they had more knowledge, but it wasn't a secret knowledge, which was a different character than that which others had. What Grigor Magistro seems to be implying in his description is that there were different kinds of knowledge which people had depending upon how advanced they were, and that if people weren't advanced, they weren't getting the real story. They were given a kind of cover story. See? That's very different from saying that people who are more advanced in knowledge are the ones who teach it to those who didn't. Now, there seem to me to be two reasons for him to have said this. First is that the Manichaeans were divided into two different groups. They were called the elect, the chosen ones, the Zidagon in Middle Persian, the ones who were selected. This is where we get the Armenian word v'churel from vizik in Middle Persian. So v'churial if we want to translate it into what Armenian Manichaeans probably called their leaders. And the auditory, the hearers, the neoshakan, who there were different sets of rules for the electi, the chosen ones, and for the hearers, the common people. The quality of knowledge wasn't different, but their ways of life were radically different. For example, the hearers were allowed to propagate. They were allowed to have children. If this weren't so, As a teacher of mine long ago pointed out, we should have witnessed the swift diminution of the Manichaean community. So, for practical reasons, the hearers were allowed to propagate in the hope that in their next incarnation they might be elected and eat nothing but cucumbers and melons, and at the time of their physical death, undergo something which was called in Parthian parinirvana, which is just the Sanskrit word parinirvana, meaning at the absolute blowout, they would leave the cycle of existence forever. It's a term borrowed from Buddhism. So, people thought that there were two different forms of knowledge in Manichaeism, the kind that the electi had. But there is another component to this, which is that of conspiracy theory. That the higher-ups always have a different body of knowledge, a secret story that we aren't getting, and that they just pawn off on us stories which really aren't valid, cover stories. And this kind of conspiracy theory, although it's very, very prominent right now in right-wing craziness in America, has always existed. Humans love to believe that somebody knows the real story but isn't telling us. And this is what Grigor uses as a polemical device against the Paulicians. The second reason I think he does this is that there may have existed a genuine diversity of opinions and beliefs amongst people loosely identified as Tundrakitsis by the Orthodox. We know that at the time, Nerses Shnor Hali wrote, for example, against the Tundrakitsis, he was also ministering to Aravordik, who sought to become Christian, who were living in Samosata, a place where we know Paulicianism was also strongly founded. Right? And that there were confusions between the Aravordiks and the Tundrakitsis. Now, we have a great deal of trouble sorting them out now, where we have all the texts and very advanced systems of scholarly analysis. To a cleric living in the 12th century, there was more room for confusion. And I suppose, well, you remember the first time that famous rubric was ever used, kill them all and let God separate the innocent, was in the killing of the Cathars. So they were lumped together. That's what I think was happening. Because as you can see in the Armenian milieu, we have room and attestation from earliest times for dualism, for dissident Christianity of various kinds, and for atheism. The three different points of view, all of which Grigor attributes to the Tundrakitsis he's attacking. So, I don't think that there ever was any secret knowledge. But I do think there was a diversity. And since there was not a hierarchy with the capacity to enforce a doctrine, a much greater diversity of points of view could exist than in the Orthodox Church. Which leads one to a second point, if I can go on for a bit about this. Most of the people who wrote against the Paulicians or other heretics in Armenian history, from Khazar Karpetsi on, all the way through Naragatsi, were themselves accused at one point or another of being heretics. In order to maintain itself, the church used the weapon of its inquisition frequently and often in an indiscriminate manner. Yes? Grigor Naragatsi was accused of being a Zeit, a Chalcedonian. His uncle Anania, one of the greatest theologians the Armenian Church has ever produced, was accused by Anania Mogatsi, the Catholicos, of being a heretic and composed his Habat Armat in response to the charge. Yeah? So, an Orthodox Church can use these accusations continually to maintain its power, and by virtue of the power it already possesses, A religious group which is not in power is, of course, in the contrary situation, yes? It can do none of these things. On the contrary, it is like a petri dish for the breeding of all sorts of free thought. And if, as one of its principles, it asserts the potential Christhood of every individual, then free thought is endemic to it. So this is how I would explain what he says.
This lecture, because when you read Manu Gaberian on this subject, one gets the impression that he stresses more on the promiscuous lifestyle of these people, these sectarians, than anything else. He doesn't speak in length on much of the rest.
Well, okay.
I didn't hear much about the promiscuity of these people.
We don't know too much about it. It's just a charge that is leveled against them. But it does go together with revolutionary movements.
Right.
I suggested, for example, in a reference to the Quakers, that Quaker leader led by his 12 female disciples, that there might well have been some promiscuity. It's something that one can observe. We have to look at the reasons for this. I'll refer to my favorite heretic, William Blake. William Blake speaks of the aftermath of a wedding as the marriage hearse. The hearse that carries away a dead body. Yes, the marriage hearse. Blake felt that institutionalized marriage, sexual prurity, sexual conservatism, and so on, these were all satanic. These were in fact the perversion of the human being. It went together with his other beliefs about how other institutions which we have perverted or destroyed the goodness in our nature in other ways. When communism came to Armenia in 1920, several things happened. First of all, as you know, already at the time of the Republic, the Dutch Constitution had begun a campaign for the liberation of women and for women's literacy. This was, of course, appropriated by the communists who said they had invented it. And they went much further. For the first 10 years or so after the Russian Revolution, the Soviet Union had what we would now call free love. Marriage could be annulled with a postcard. Yeah? All sexual practices were legal. The person who made them illegal was Stalin, who said there that we had to return to kind of good old-fashioned morality. And we know what good old-fashioned morality was. But at the beginning, the Russian Revolution went together with the sexual revolution, and this was true in Armenia too. Something else happened at the same time. After the Bolshevik Revolution, the communist propagandists in Armenia wrote, Pucker Meher has come out of his cave. So there was a kind of revival of a pagan millenarianism, yes? That the world doesn't end in some supernatural way. The world ends when the old world is transformed and becomes the new. They knew exactly what they were doing when they said all of these things. Now, if we couple this with the attitudes that I pointed out that prevail in Eastern Turkey towards communists, members of the PKK, Kurds in general, and so on, you can see that the two things run together. I would suggest, personally, that if you believe in one form of human liberation, you can't arbitrarily not believe in the others as well. Yeah? You can if you're a hypocrite, but not in any other way. Yeah? Women's rights go together with Protestant Reformation. in Christianity. You mentioned that I worked for the Armenian Church for a year. While I was working there, the head of religious education was a woman. And she was moving inevitably towards the view women should be allowed to be priests. Together with this view, she was moving towards all sorts of other opinions as well. I said, Sirarpi, I think you should become Paulicians. This isn't the place for you. I won't tell you her last name. That's not her last name. No. Sirarpi X Yan said,
There's one
Anyway, she did it, by the way.
She went to the St. Mary's.
She's my big mouth. I should have said somebody, but the point is she stayed Orthodox, so, yeah. But
many heretic movements. What's special about the Paulicians? Why should we let it sneak out there?
well, I can answer the second question more easily than the first. The answer to the second simply is that they are important because they are the major heresy. All the other heresies that existed in Armenia have left barely a trace. There's hardly any literature about them. And on the political scene, the Paulicians were the only heresy that ever mounted an actual military threat to the Byzantine Empire. Yeah? So that at the time. But we can tell that they were enough of a danger that 10, 20 villages at a time might rise up in open rebellion against their Orthodox masters, destroy monasteries. There were times when this was like a volcanic flood. But I can't put a number on it, and I don't know that anybody has tried to. We don't have the figures.
Did the agnosticians and the Paulicians have anything in common other than they were heretics?
Agnostics? Well, I would suggest that there were some agnostics amongst the Paulicians. You see, that Paulician was a very wide, a term that embraced a very wide variety of beliefs. For example, let's use the word Protestant. The word Protestant can include Southern Baptists. It can also include Unitarian Universalists. At a certain distance, the word ceases to have very much meaning except as a very general category, a nomenclature, nothing more. See? So amongst the Paulicians too, I think that there were most likely agnostics. Yeah? Bob Lyon seems to be an agnostic in many ways, if you push him. Yeah? And people who simply saw themselves as Christian reformers. In other words, that there isn't a dogmatic rigidity, but a kind of a spectrum with many shades. And since there are shades, you don't really sense when you've got from one extreme to the next, but the extremes are still there within the same group.
Did they build church with traditional Armenian architecture or something different, or what?
We don't know of any Paulician architecture except for their fortress at Divri, the ruins of which are still there. So they built the fortress. I don't think they built churches. The whole point.
They worship
in people's houses.
Only in the houses.
Yes. As far as I know. That's what they did in Arkveli. And that's what they did in Divrig as well, in people's houses. The word church, after all, doesn't mean building. Here I start to sound like a Paulician again, but I don't. Yeah.
Go ahead.
I hear you said that there was quite a intolerance in Armenia towards this Protestant sects, such as Paulicians and the rest. Why was that Armenian church, as far as I know, never experienced a persecution equal to what happened in Europe, as witch hunt and burning on cross and things like that? How would you explain that?
Well, their answer is that to the extent that they were able, the church authorities did do those things. The Council of Sha'apiman is only one of several such, which prescribe these draconian punishments for heretics. The same punishments for heretics, for the Mutzachnyai, that the Council of Sha'apiman prescribes, were prescribed also for Tundraketsis. Later on, 5 centuries later, the same punishments. We have no particular reason to believe that such things weren't done, because the reactions of the Tundraketsis to the Orthodox Church were equally violent. They would burn monasteries, kill monks. We know of Mechlu, who used to stab them through the heart as though they were vampires. So there was a lot of bad feeling, and it was mutual. The reason that the medieval Armenian Inquisitions weren't as widespread as the Catholic Inquisitions in medieval Europe, and then also at the time of the Spanish Inquisition, late 1400s, was that the Armenian Church did not exercise the same degree of temporal power throughout much of its history that the medieval Catholic Church did. It was never in the position to force the Holy Roman Emperor to circle the papal residence on his knees in the snow at Kanasa. That never happened in Armenia. To suggest such a thing to a Nacharar, he would probably found himself hanging from the nearest tree. I say this because that's what happened. The Armenian Nacharars and kings never submitted in the way their European cousins did to the power of the church. Of how some righteous holy man would go up to a Nacharar and say, "You have been wicked."
Very, very much for accepting Hamazkayin's invitation for this incredibly detailed and brilliant analysis.